beneath layers of green paint, a lamb bleeds. Not metaphorically. According to infrared reflectography conducted by the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels between 2010 and 2016, the original Lamb of God, painted by Hubert and Jan van Eyck in 1432, had blood streaming from its chest into a chalice. Somewhere between the 15th century and 1550, someone painted over that wound. They softened the eyes. They made the lamb look forward instead of at you. The conservation team at the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent documented 23 separate campaigns of overpainting across the 12 panels. This is not the altarpiece the Van Eycks finished. This is what 5 centuries of fear, piety, and revision have allowed to survive. This is not fiction. This is what this painting still reveals. The Ghent Altarpiece poses a question that has haunted every curator who has stood before it. How do you preserve something when the act of preservation has already changed it? When restoration becomes erasure? When the hand that meant to protect also concealed? Tonight, we are going to walk through those layers. Through the workshop where 2 brothers may or may not have collaborated. Through the wars that scattered its panels across Europe. Through the decisions made in dim church vestries and museum laboratories that determined which version of truth we would inherit. If you are listening to this between 10 at night and 3 in the morning, you have found the right place. This is not a lecture. This is a portal. If this kind of deep dive into art history helps you wind down, I would love to hear which painting I should cover next. Leave a comment. And if you want more of these long-form art documentaries designed for late-night listening, subscribe. We make one every week. Now, close your eyes if you want, or keep them open. Either way, you are about to step inside. It is April 1432. You are standing in the chapel of Juisvede in St. Bavo's Cathedral, Ghent. The air smells of beeswax and damp stone. Incense from morning mass still clings to the walls. In front of you, nearly 12 feet tall when the wings are open, is an altarpiece that has just been installed. The paint is so fresh, you could still smell the linseed oil if you leaned close enough. The center panel shows a lamb on an altar, surrounded by angels and saints in a green meadow that seems to recede forever. The lamb looks directly at you. Its chest is open. Blood pours into a golden chalice. Around the lamb, fountains flow. On the distant horizon, you can see the towers of a city that might be Jerusalem, or might be Ghent, or might be the New Jerusalem from Revelation. The contract for this work, preserved in Ghent's municipal archives, names 2 painters, Hubert van Eyck, who began it, and Jan van Eyck, who finished it after Hubert's death in 1426. But here is what the contract does not say: which brother painted which panel. Art historians have argued for 6 centuries. Some say Hubert never existed. Some say Jan invented him to claim a greater legacy. Some say the hands are so unified that distinguishing them is impossible. In 2016, a dendrochronological analysis of the oak panels, published in the journal Dendrochronologia, determined that the wood could not have been cut before 1491. That means if Hubert died in 1426, the brothers have 5 years, maximum, to complete 24 square meters of painted surface, much of it requiring dozens of translucent oil glazes. 5 years. 2 men. A project funded by Juisvede, a wealthy city magistrate, and his wife, Elizabeth Borluut, who wanted their portraits included, kneeling in prayer on the outer wings. This was not devotion alone. This was power. To commission an altarpiece of this scale, was to claim spiritual authority, civic prominence, and a permanent place in the memory of Ghent. The Van Eycks understood this. They built a paradise so detailed, so optically persuasive, that standing before it felt like standing at the threshold of heaven itself. But even then, something was already wrong. Let us go back further. Ghent in the early 15th century was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, built on the wool trade. The guild system controlled almost everything: who could paint, what materials they could use, how apprentices advanced. Painters were part of the Guild of St. Luke, which also included glaziers, saddlers, and bookbinders. The guild rules, documented in Ghent's city registers, specified the purity of pigments, the preparation of panels, even the acceptable thickness of gold leaf. To work outside these rules was to risk fines or expulsion. Hubert and Jan van Eyck worked within this system, but they were also innovating in ways that unsettled it. They perfected oil painting, a technique that allowed for unprecedented control of light and color. Traditional tempera dried quickly and required fast, decisive brushwork. Oil stayed wet. You could layer it. You could glaze one transparent color over another and create the illusion of depth, of atmosphere, of skin that seemed to breathe. According to Ernst van de Wetering, Professor Emeritus of Art History at the University of Amsterdam, the Van Eyck's technique required up to 20 separate glaze layers for a single passage of flesh tone. Each layer had to dry completely before the next could be applied. This was not fast work. This was obsessive, molecular precision, and it was expensive. A single ounce of ultramarine blue, made from ground lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, cost more than gold. The Ghent Altarpiece uses ultramarine lavishly, in the Virgin's robe, in the sky, in the distant hills. The contract required the patrons to provide the pigments. Juiceweid's account books, housed in Ghent's municipal archive, show payments for lapis, for vermilion made from cinnabar, for lead white, for azurite, for verdigris, for the rare organic red lake made from crushed insects. These were not just colors, these were investments. They signaled that this work mattered more than anything else in the chapel, perhaps in the entire cathedral. But the Van Eycks were not alone in the workshop. Infrared imaging has revealed underdrawings beneath the paint, sketches in liquid metal that guided the final composition. Some of these underdrawings show changes. Figures moved, gestures adjusted, entire sections rethought. This suggests a collaborative process, possibly involving assistants or apprentices whose names have not survived. What we call the Van Eyck's vision was likely shaped by multiple hands, all working under intense pressure to complete the commission before the patrons died, before the money ran out, before the shifting politics of Ghent made this kind of display too dangerous. And then Hubert died. The inscription on the frame says, "Jan completed what Hubert began," but it does not say how much was already finished. Letters from Jan van Eyck to other patrons, preserved at the Burgundian archives in Lille, France, describe the immense labor required to finish the altarpiece. He refers to it as a burden, a weight he carries alone. In one letter dated 1428, he writes to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, apologizing for delays on another commission because the Ghent work consumes all his time. He does not mention Hubert. He does not explain why the work is taking so long. He only says it is not yet done. Imagine the studio in those years. The 12 panels, some finished, some barely begun, leaning against the walls, the smell of turpentine and walnut oil, the grinding of pigments in a mortar, the scrape of a palette knife mixing binder and colour on a stone slab, Jan working by candlelight and then by daylight through narrow windows, his assistants preparing panels, sanding them smooth, applying gesso, burnishing gold leaf onto halos and borders. The pressure of a patron who has already paid a fortune and is getting older. The pressure of a city watching. The pressure of a dead brother whose contribution cannot be disentangled from his own. And in the center of it all, that lamb, the adoration of the mystic lamb panel, is the theological heart of the altarpiece. It depicts a scene from the book of Revelation. The Lamb of God, symbol of Christ's sacrifice, worshipped by angels, apostles, martyrs, and saints in a paradisiacal meadow. Around the Lamb, a fountain inscribed with the Latin phrase, "This is the fountain of the water of life, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb." The entire composition radiates toward this central figure. Everything else, the hundreds of figures, the meticulously painted flowers, the distant towers, the glowing sky, exist to frame this one image, a lamb with a human gaze and an open wound. But the lamb you see today is not the lamb Jan van Eyck painted. Conservation scientists at Belgium's Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage used infrared reflectography to peer beneath the surface paint. What they found, published in a 2016 technical report, was startling. The original lamb had a more solemn frontal gaze. The face was less rounded, more angular. The ears were positioned differently, and most significantly, the wound in the chest was more graphic. Blood flowed visibly into the chalice. The lamb's expression was not serene. It was aware. It looked at you with what one conservator described as an almost accusatory intensity. Someone, sometime before 1550, decided that intensity was too much. They overpainted the lamb, softened the features, made the blood less explicit, made the gaze less direct. We do not know who made this decision or why. Church records from St. Bavo's do not mention any official restoration campaign in that period. The most likely explanation, according to Maximilian Martens, professor of art history at Ghent University, is that a well-meaning priest or sacristan hired a local painter to improve the work. This was common. Altarpieces were not seen as untouchable masterpieces. They were functional objects. If the imagery became uncomfortable, if tastes changed, if the paint cracked or darkened, you fixed it. You updated it. You made it acceptable again. But acceptable to whom? And at what cost? Let us zoom out for a moment. By the mid-16th century, the Ghent Altarpiece had already survived its first major crisis. In 1566, during the wave of Protestant iconoclasm that swept through the Low Countries, rioters entered St. Bavo's and destroyed religious images they deemed idolatrous. The altarpiece was hidden, dismantled, and stored in the cathedral tower. It survived, but that survival required invisibility. For decades, the panels remained hidden, wrapped in cloth, seen by almost no one. When the altarpiece was finally reinstalled in 1594, it returned to a different world. The Counter-Reformation had begun. The Catholic Church, responding to Protestant critiques, emphasized restraint, decorum, and theological clarity in religious art. The graphic blood pouring from the lamb's chest might have seemed too medieval, too visceral, too much like the kind of imagery Protestants mocked as superstitious excess. The overpainting may have been an attempt to protect the work by making it conform to new standards of acceptable piety. But this decision created a paradox. To protect the altarpiece, they erased part of its meaning. The lamb's direct gaze was part of its power. It implicated the viewer. It said, "This sacrifice is for you. Look at it." The overpainting broke that connection. It turned the lamb into a symbol, distant and decorative, rather than a presence. And it was not the only change. X-ray analysis conducted during the 2012 to 2020 restoration campaign revealed that nearly every panel had been altered. The Virgin Mary's face had been repainted to make her look younger. Adam and Eve, who appear nude on the outer wings, had been given modesty leaves that were not in the original composition. The saints in the Eyck background had been shifted slightly to create more visual balance. The sky had been repainted to cover areas where the original azurite pigment had degraded to brown. Each change made sense in its moment. Each was an attempt to preserve, to clarify, to improve. But together, they accumulated into a kind of palimpsest. The Ghent Altarpiece became a record not just of the Van Eyck's vision, but of 5 centuries of decisions about what that vision should look like. Now think about the human beings who made those decisions. The 16th century priest who worried the blood was too graphic, the 17th century restorer who thought Adam and Eve needed modesty leaves, the 18th century conservator who scraped off old varnish and accidentally removed glaze layers, the 19th century art historian who insisted the altarpiece needed to be unified into a single coherent style and commissioned a restorer to harmonize the colors. Each believed they were helping. Each believed they were acting in the work's best interest, and each left a mark that could not be undone. In 1794, French revolutionary troops occupied Ghent and confiscated 4 central panels, including the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. The panels were taken to Paris and displayed in the Louvre as spoils of war. They were returned after Napoleon's defeat in 1815. But the experience of dismantling and transporting the work caused damage. Paint flaked, joints between panels loosened. The oak wood, exposed to changes in humidity and temperature, warped slightly. In 1816, the church sold 6 outer wing panels to an art dealer to raise money for repairs to the cathedral. Those panels ended up in a museum in Berlin. The remaining panels stayed in Ghent, incomplete. For over a century, the altarpiece existed in fragments, scattered across Europe. When the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 required Germany to return the panels, the work was finally reassembled. But by then, so much had changed. The panels had been cleaned, revarnished, and retouched in different workshops using different techniques. When they were reunited, the color balance was off. Some panels looked warm and golden. Others looked cool and grey. They no longer quite matched. And then, the Second World War began. In 1940, as German forces advanced into Belgium, the altarpiece was evacuated. The panels were removed from their frames, wrapped in protective cloth, and transported to southern France for safekeeping. But in 1942, with Nazi forces closing in, the panels were moved again, hidden in a castle, then moved again, hidden in a mine. Adolf Hitler had personal designs on the altarpiece. He considered it Germanic art, part of the cultural heritage of the Reich. Heinrich Himmler, according to archives at the United States National Archives and Records Administration, kept detailed inventories of looted art, and the Ghent altarpiece was marked as a priority acquisition for the Führermuseum Hitler planned to build in Linz, Austria. In August 1942, Nazi officials found the hiding place. The panels were seized and transported to Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, where they were stored alongside thousands of other looted artworks. They remained there until April 1945, when the advancing American army discovered them in a salt mine near Altarpiece, Austria. A dedicated team of monuments men, soldiers trained as art historians and conservators, oversaw the recovery. Lieutenant George Stout documented the condition of the panels in field reports preserved at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. He noted that several panels had been damaged by humidity in the mine. The paint surface had developed a whitish bloom, a sign of moisture penetration. The wood had absorbed water and swelled. When the panels returned to Ghent in 1945, they needed immediate conservation. But Belgium was devastated by war. There was no money for restoration. The altarpiece went back on display in St. Bavo's Cathedral, still damaged, still incomplete. One panel, The Righteous Judges, had been stolen in 1934 and never recovered. A copy painted by Belgian artist Joseph van der Weken hung in its place, a constant reminder of what was missing. For decades, the altarpiece remained in this state. Visitors came, scholars studied it. But the damage accumulated. Soot from candles darkened the surface. Humidity caused the wood to expand and contract, creating tiny stress fractures in the paint. In 1986, a comprehensive conditions survey conducted by Belgium's Institut Royal du Patrimoine Artistique concluded that without intervention, the altarpiece would continue to deteriorate. The paint layers were lifting. The varnish had turned brown and obscured the colors. The wood panels were infested with beetles. In 2012, the Belgian government approved funding for a complete restoration, the most ambitious in the work's history. The panels would be removed one by one, transported to a laboratory in Brussels, and treated using the most advanced conservation techniques available. The project was expected to take 8 years. What they found changed everything. Under ultraviolet light, the conservators could see exactly where previous restorations had added new paint. Under infrared light, they could see the original underdrawings. Under X-ray, they could see changes the Van Eycks themselves had made during the painting process. Using micro samples of paint, analyzed with electron microscopy, they could identify the exact pigments used in each layer and determine which were original and which were later additions. And slowly, they began to remove the overpainting. The process was painstaking. Conservators used scalpels and solvents to dissolve centuries of varnish and added paint, one microscopic layer at a time. They worked under magnification, removing later paint while leaving the original surface untouched. It took months to clean a single panel. But as they worked, the original colors emerged. The ER greens became vibrant again. The blues deepened. The flesh tones regained their luminosity. And the lamb, when they finally reached it, looked different. Hélène Dubois, head of conservation at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage, described the moment in a 2019 interview with the art newspaper. She said the original lamb had an emotional directness that the overpaint had completely suppressed. The eyes, she said, were painted with such precision that they seemed to track you as you moved. The wound was not gratuitous. It was theological. It was the visual embodiment of sacrifice made real, immediate, inescapable. But here's the problem. The conservators faced a choice. Should they remove all the overpainting and reveal the original? Or should they preserve some of the later layers as part of the work's history? Different stakeholders had different opinions. Art historians wanted to see the Van Eyck's original vision. Church officials worried that removing familiar elements would confuse worshippers who had prayed before the altarpiece for generations. The Belgian government, which funded the restoration, wanted a decision that would satisfy both scholarly rigor and public expectation. They chose a middle path. On some panels, they removed all later paint and revealed the original surface. On others, they left later additions in place, documenting them thoroughly, but preserving them as historical evidence. The lamb, after much debate, was restored to its original appearance: the direct gaze, the visible wound, the blood. When the restored lamb was unveiled in January 2020, reactions were immediate and divided. Some art historians celebrated it as a revelation, a return to the Van Eyck's uncompromising vision. Others found it unsettling, even disturbing. The lamb's humanized face, its unblinking stare, felt more like a rebuke than an invitation. One critic, writing in Apollo magazine, described it as too intense for comfort, a reminder that sacrifice is not abstract. And that, perhaps, is the point. The Van Eycks painted a lamb that demands something of you. The overpaint softened that demand. It made the image easier to live with, easier to worship in front of, easier to ignore. The restoration removed that ease. It returned the work to what it was always meant to be: a confrontation. But what about the parts that can never be restored? The Righteous Judges panel, stolen in 1934, remains missing. Despite decades of investigation, ransom notes, and alleged sightings, it has never been recovered. The copy that hangs in its place is skillful, but it is not the same. You can see the difference in the brushwork, in the quality of the light, in the way the figures relate to each other. The theft left a permanent wound in the altarpiece, a gap that cannot be filled. And what about the changes the Van Eycks themselves made? Infrared imaging shows that Jan moved figures, adjusted compositions, rethought entire sections as he worked. The version we see is not his first idea. It is his last idea. But what if his first idea was better? What if the changes he made were compromises, responses to pressure from patrons or guild rules or his own exhaustion? We will never know. Those earlier versions are gone, hidden beneath layers of paint we cannot remove without destroying what is on top. This is the paradox of preservation. To save something, you have to change it. To clean it, you have to touch it. To study it, you have to risk damaging it. Every restoration is a negotiation between past and present, between what was and what we want it to be. The Ghent Altarpiece has been negotiated more than almost any other artwork in history. It has been overpainted, vandalized, stolen, dismantled, hidden, recovered, cleaned, and restored. It has survived iconoclasm, war, Nazi looting, and 5 centuries of good intentions. And it is still here. Today, the restored panels hang in a climate-controlled pavilion inside St. Bavo's Cathedral. Visitors pass through security and stand behind a glass barrier. The light is carefully regulated to prevent further fading. The humidity is monitored constantly. The wood is stable. The paint is secure, for now. But the question remains, what are we preserving? Is it the painting the Van Eycks finished in 1432? Or is it the accumulated history of everything that happened to it afterward? Is the overpainting part of the artwork, or is it damage? Is the theft of the Righteous Judges a loss, or is it part of the story? Can you separate the object from its history? The Ghent Altarpiece suggests you cannot. Every crack, every restoration, every theft, every decision to hide or reveal, to clean or leave alone, has become part of what the work means. It is not just a painting. It is a record of human attempts to hold on to something precious across centuries of violence, change, and forgetting. It is a monument to devotion and to vandalism, to care and to carelessness, to the impulse to preserve and the impulse to revise. And at the center of it all, restored to its original intensity, is a lamb that looks at you. Blood flows from his chest, the fountain flows, the meadow glows, the angels sing, and you stand there, behind the glass, trying to hold its gaze. Can you? The Van Eycks asked that question in 1432. It is still the right question. Because what the Ghent Altarpiece teaches us, through all its transformations, is that looking is not passive. To really see something, to stand in front of it and let it speak, requires courage. It requires acknowledging what has been lost and what endures. It requires recognizing that preservation is an act of interpretation, that every hand that touches a work leaves a trace, and that no object, no matter how carefully protected, stays the same. The lamb bleeds. It has always bled. The paint that once obscured that wound is gone now. But the question the wound asks remains open. What are you willing to see? What are you willing to carry? What sacrifice, made 600 years ago in a workshop in Ghent, still speaks to you across the glass, across the years, across the space between what was painted and what survives? The altarpiece does not answer. It only asks, and that perhaps is why it endures.